In the 1960s, an attorney moved through the cypress swamp of central Florida, buying thousands of acres under a false name for a client he would not name. The buyer was Walt Disney, and the land would become Walt Disney World. But the strangest thing was never the theme park. It was that these 25,000 acres, spread across Orange and Osceola counties, would soon become, in the eyes of the law, their own government. It would be a private state with the authority of a county, the legal right to build its own nuclear power plant, and a ballot the company could never lose. For 55 years, it would run on close to $1 billion of public debt. Behind the phantom companies that assembled the land stood a former officer of American intelligence, and when the kingdom was finally condemned, its dying board would bind its survival to the death of the last living descendant of a king. The only monument the secret ever earned was a row of company names lettered on the upper windows of a main street that did not yet exist. This is the story of the company that quietly became a government. Chapter 1. The Buyers with No Names. The government came later. First, there was only the land, and the land had to be taken without a single seller ever understanding what was being assembled around him. In 1964, Walt Disney had already fixed on the interior of Florida, the flat cattle country and cypress bottomland south of Orlando, where two highways crossed near a slow brown waterway called Reedy Creek. Disney did not want a modest parcel for a theme park. He wanted an expanse many times larger than any park could use, tens of thousands of acres of drained pasture and palmetto scrub, and he understood a simple and unforgiving arithmetic. The moment the landowners of Orange and Osceola counties learned that the Walt Disney Company stood behind the offers, every asking price would climb out of reach. He had reason to fear it. In Anaheim, California, the first Disneyland had been hemmed in almost overnight by the motels, gas stations, and billboards that crowded against its fences, ground Disney neither owned nor controlled, and the memory of that surrounded park stayed with him. This time he meant to buy quietly, completely, and before anyone knew his name, and for that he needed men who understood how a secret was kept. The man he turned to was Paul Helliwell, a Miami lawyer who had spent the Second World War as an officer of the Office of Strategic Services and had gone on to serve in the Central Intelligence Agency. Helliwell had come to Miami at the opening of the 1960s to help coordinate the covert campaign against Fidel Castro's Cuba, and he brought to the buying of Florida the same tradecraft he had once aimed at foreign governments. He counseled Disney's chief counsel, an attorney named Robert Foster, to move through the state without ever speaking the Disney name, to deal through intermediaries and quiet options, and to sign for the land under a face that was not his own. In the county courthouses and cattlemen's offices of Central Florida, Foster became a soft-spoken, out-of-town buyer called Bob Price, a man with money and no visible master. The purchases themselves were made not by Disney, but by a small crowd of companies that existed only on paper. There was the I-4 Corporation, its coined name a quiet play on the interstate highway, Interstate 4, that ran past the property. There was Compass East Corporation and the Latin American Development and Management Corporation, whose grand title hinted at foreign money chasing Florida sunshine. There was Tomahawk Properties and Reedy Creek Ranch Incorporated and Bay Lake Properties Incorporated. Each of these letterhead companies was a mask. None of them appeared to have anything to do with the others, and none of them appeared to have anything to do with Walt Disney or the company that carried his name. A rancher approached by Tomahawk Properties had no way of knowing that the buyer at his fence line was the same buyer already dealing, a county away, as Compass East. The companies moved separately through the deed records, sharing nothing on paper that a curious eye could follow back to a single hand. The effect was precisely what Helliwell had designed. Because no seller believed he was selling to anyone of consequence, and because no seller could see the shape of the hole, the land came astonishingly cheap. Ordinary parcels of swamp and pasture changed hands for as little as roughly $80 an acre, and the choicer tracts for around $145 an acre, sums that within a decade would look almost imaginary for ground beside the future Walt Disney World. To the cattlemen and absentee owners signing the deeds, it seemed a small mercy that anyone wanted their mosquito-ridden bottomland at all. Piece by piece, recorded deed by recorded deed, the phantom companies stitched tens of thousands of acres of central Florida into a single holding whose true owner appeared nowhere in the county books. There was in all of this a peculiar act of invention. Disney's men had not merely bought land under a false name, they had conjured a population of corporations, given each a plausible purpose and history, and turned them loose across the Florida map like characters in search of a story. For a time, the concealment held without a flaw. Through 1964 and into 1965, the deeds accumulated in the Orange and Osceola County record books, and Central Florida understood only that someone was quietly buying a great deal of seemingly worthless swamp. Talk of a mystery buyer drifted through Orlando, and the guesses ran in every direction but the right one. Month after month, the land assembled itself in near silence, exactly as the men who designed that silence intended. But a secret that requires dozens of purchases, scores of sellers, and a paper trail winding openly through 2 county courthouses is a secret with too many seams to hold forever. The land was nearly whole. The invented companies had almost finished their work. And in a newspaper office in Orlando, a reporter had already begun to study the same public deeds the phantom firms had left behind, and to circle toward the one question none of them could afford to have answered. Chapter 2. The Reporter Who Guessed. The secret that had held through dozens of purchases and a paper trail winding openly through 2 county courthouses finally broke. And it broke not to a prosecutor or a rival developer, but to a woman with a notebook in a downtown Orlando newsroom. Her name was Emily Bavar, a reporter and editor at the Orlando Sentinel, and through the humid summer of 1965, she had followed the same rumor that puzzled all of Central Florida, the rumor of a nameless buyer quietly stitching together the cattle pasture and cypress swamp south of the city. The invented companies with their unmarked deeds had covered their tracks well, and for months the identity behind them held. But Bavar had begun to suspect that the trail through the courthouse record books led somewhere. The guessing crowds of Orlando had not thought to look. That autumn, the Walt Disney Organization flew Bavar and a party of other journalists across the country to Anaheim, California, to tour the original Disneyland as the park celebrated its 10th year. For a decade, that California park had shown the world what Disney could build, and Bavar wanted to know what the man intended to build next and where. Somewhere among the turrets of the castle and the crowded midways of the amusement park, she set the tour's press releases aside and put the Florida question to Disney himself, asking the silver-haired showman directly whether he was the hidden buyer behind the great land grab south of Orlando. Whatever Disney said in answer, it did not reassure her. Something in the reply of the man beneath the studio lights persuaded her of exactly what he meant to deny, and she walked back out through the gates of Disneyland, convinced that the smiling figure who had built it was the same invisible hand assembling the swamps of Florida. She carried that conviction home to the newsroom. In October of 1965, the Orlando Sentinel ran her conclusion across its pages in plain black type. The mystery buyer of Central Florida was Walt Disney, and the drained cattle country south of Orlando was destined to become a vast eastern Disneyland. It was, the Sentinel would later judge, the single biggest scoop in the newspaper's history, a front page that beat the governor of Florida's own official announcement of the project by roughly 5 days. The company that had labored so long to keep Disney's name off the deeds now watched a Florida newspaper print it in banner headlines for the whole state to read. A single reporter with a notebook had unraveled in one California interview what a year of paper companies and borrowed tradecraft had been built to conceal. By the time Bavar's story reached print, the concealment had already finished its work. The phantom companies had stitched together nearly 25,000 acres of central Florida pasture, palmetto scrub, and standing water, an expanse larger than many an American city, and almost every deed in the courthouse files had been signed before the seller across the fence line knew the name of the buyer. It was ground enough for a city, and a city was precisely what Disney intended, though almost no one studying the maps in Florida yet grasped how literally he meant it. The land was whole. The secret's usefulness was spent, and its breaking changed nothing about the acreage already bought and recorded. What the revelation did change was the argument that rose in its place, an argument the columns and courthouse corridors of Central Florida would carry for years afterward. To some, the thing Disney's men had done was simply shrewd enterprise, a legal and resourceful way to buy open swampland at a fair market price that only a rich and famous name would have driven out of reach. To others, it wore the look of a quiet swindle, a wealthy corporation hiding behind invented names to lift valuable ground from cattlemen and widows who would never have parted with it so cheaply had they known whose kingdom they were feeding. Both verdicts found their believers in the newspaper pages of the day, and both of them still stand along the same central Florida roads. For the revelation did not end Disney's designs on the state. It freed them. And it freed Disney to say aloud at last what he had wanted in the Florida interior all along. What he wanted had never been only a theme park behind a ticket booth. He wanted room, tens of thousands of acres of drained and open land, and more than room, he wanted control, a degree of authority over the ground that no ordinary developer in the country had ever held. The gates and the castle were to be the smallest part of it. Therefore, when Disney at last sat down with the leaders of the state of Florida to talk of building his kingdom in their swamp, he came to the table with a condition. Before the first canal was dug or the first castle raised over the Palmetto Flats, Florida would have to grant him something no company in America had ever been granted, and it is what he demanded in exchange for building it that would turn a private land deal into a private state. Chapter 3. The Lesson of Anaheim. What Disney demanded of Florida was not a permit or a tax break, but something far closer to sovereignty, and the reason he demanded it lay a continent away, in a citrus town in Southern California called Anaheim. For 10 years, the Disneyland Castle had stood at the center of the most successful amusement park the country had ever built, drawing millions of visitors through its gates each season. But the ground Disney's company actually owned in Anaheim was small, a single parcel of former orange grove barely broad enough to hold the park itself. Everything beyond the earthen berm that ringed the park belonged to other people. And other people had understood exactly what the park was worth. In the decades since Disneyland opened, the orange groves that once surrounded it had been scraped away and paved into a dense commercial ring, a clutter of cheap motels, gas stations, drive-in diners, and souvenir stands crowding up to the very edge of the Disney property. Neon signs advertising vacant rooms and free parking rose within sight of the castle turrets. The company that drew the crowds could not command a single foot of it. That was the injury Disney never forgot. The motel keepers and filling station owners along Harbor Boulevard had built nothing and invented nothing and drawn no one to Anaheim. They had simply bought the land beside a thing that Disney made and grown prosperous on the overflow of his crowds. They set their own prices, raised their own signs, and answered to no authority but the city of Anaheim. The value the park created spilled outward across a property line the company could not police and was gathered up by strangers. There was a vanished world buried under that ring of asphalt, though it was not the one the company mourned. Before the motels, Anaheim had been a quiet town of orange orchards and Sunday churches, its horizon a low green sea of citrus trees running back toward the hills. Within a few years the trees were gone and the neon signs had taken their place. What the company grieved was never the lost groves. It was the profit and the control that had drained away into other men's parking lots, and the ordinary California town that had paved itself over for the boom earned no gratitude in the ledger for the trouble. Disney resolved that it would not happen a second time. The next park would not sit exposed at the heart of a landscape it could not govern. It would sit instead at the center of a domain it owned outright and controlled entirely, a buffer of empty miles laid down between the dream and the neon. The land already assembled in secret across central Florida gave him the room to build such a buffer. What it did not yet give him was the authority to rule it. And authority was precisely the thing the lesson of Anaheim had taught him to want above all else. Ownership, Disney had come to see, did not bring authority with it. The largest landholder in a Florida county was still bound by that county's ordinances, still answerable to its inspectors and its commissioners and its slow public plans, still one voice among many at a courthouse he did not control. A buffer of empty acres could hold the motels back from the fences, but it left the county government firmly in charge of what rose inside them. Disney meant to answer to no rules but his own. Therefore, when his men carried their proposal north to the leaders of Florida, they came asking for far more than the right to build a theme park in the swamp. They asked for the right to govern the ground they built upon, to run the tens of thousands of acres they had quietly assembled with the authority of a county, rather than as the guest of one, free of the ordinary local governments on either side of the property line. No motel and no filling station would ever be permitted to ring this park as they had ringed the last, because the company itself would hold the power to say what could rise upon the land and what could not. It was an extraordinary thing for a private company to ask of a state, and Florida in the middle 1960s was extraordinarily willing to hear it. The offer Disney's men laid before the officials in Tallahassee was the offer every underdeveloped state longed to receive. Tens of thousands of new jobs, a northbound flood of tourists, and the money they carried south, and the prestige of hosting the most famous name in American entertainment on drained cattle land that had produced almost nothing for anyone before. Florida still sold itself in that decade as a country of citrus groves and coastal beaches, its vast interior thinly settled and lightly taxed, and a project of this scale in the middle of the state was the kind of prize a governor might campaign on for a generation. So the state made ready to give Disney what he asked, and to give it in the permanent form of a statute. In the drafting rooms of the Florida Capitol, a document was quietly taking shape, one that would hand a single private corporation a measure of authority over its own land, unlike anything a legislature in America had ever granted a company before. What that document actually contained, almost none of the men who would soon rise to vote on it had yet troubled to read. Chapter 4. A State Writes a Company a Kingdom. The document that had been taking shape in the drafting rooms of the Florida Capitol emerged in the spring of 1967 as a bill. and the men who had written it understood exactly how little of it would ever be read. It ran to 92 printed pages, a length no ordinary local measure approached, dense with the technical vocabulary of easements, plat maps, and boundary descriptions that few members of either house had the time or the appetite to work through. The lawyers who had prepared it for Disney had intended precisely that heaviness. Folded inside the plain language of a Central Florida drainage district was a grant of governmental power unlike anything a Florida legislature had ever written for a private company. The measure was assigned a number, House Bill 486, and it moved through the marble chambers of the Florida House and Senate in the opening months of the session with almost none of the scrutiny its contents deserved. To legislators from a poor and thinly settled interior state, the bill read as the enabling paperwork for the largest private investment the state had ever been offered. They passed it with the confidence of men who believed they were approving a theme park on drained cattle land, and moved on to the next item on the calendar. On the 12th of May, 1967, Governor Claude Kirk signed the measure into law at the executive desk in Tallahassee, and it entered the Florida statute books as Chapter 67-764, the Reedy Creek Improvement Act. Kirk was a Republican newly elected in a state that had long voted Democratic, a governor hungry for the industry and the headlines the Disney project promised to a decade of Florida boosters. The signing was carried out as the ordinary business of economic development rather than as the extraordinary transfer of authority the 92 pages in fact contained. What the statute created was the Reedy Creek Improvement District, a single governmental entity laid across nearly 25,000 acres of drained pasture and cypress swamp in Orange and Osceola counties, the two jurisdictions the Disney lawyers had been so careful to buy across in secret. Within the boundaries inked onto the plat maps attached to the act, the district was granted the authority of a county government over its own land. It was the power to make binding public rules on a defined territory that ordinary landowners, however vast their holdings, had never before been permitted to hold in the state of Florida. Orange and Osceola counties, the elected governments whose maps had until that morning covered every acre of the property, saw their ordinary jurisdiction over the drained interior quietly recede to the boundary of the new district and stop at its fence line. Inside those surveyed borders, the company's district would answer to almost no courthouse but its own. The instrument that made this possible was an old and unremarkable feature of American government called the special district. Across the country, state legislatures had long created such districts to perform narrow public tasks that a regular county would not. Draining a marsh, controlling mosquitoes, lighting a rural road, piping water to a stretch of farmland. Each was a small government with a single purpose and a fixed boundary, empowered to tax and to borrow and to build within its own limited domain. On its printed face, the Reedy Creek Improvement District was one more of these humble entities, a drainage authority for a wet corner of central Florida, named for the sluggish creek that wandered through the property. But the powers written into its 92 pages reached far past the draining of any swamp, and the legislators who approved it had chartered a special district in name that was, in substance, something the country had no ordinary word for. The one man who had wanted it most never saw the governor's signature dry. Walt Disney had died the previous December, months before the Florida legislature took up the bill that would hand his company its kingdom, and the act passed into law over the signature of a governor for a founder who was already in his grave. The company carried the measure through the Capitol without him. The government it created would outlast not only its architect, but the century in which he had first imagined the swamp remade. There was a quiet symmetry in how the thing was done. The same secrecy that had assembled the land in silence now assembled the government in plain sight, buried in the numbing pages of a statute no one bothered to finish. A legislature acting in daylight, in a public chamber under a recorded vote, had handed a private corporation the standing of a county without any of the men present quite grasping the size of what they had granted. For all its modest drainage district language, the Reedy Creek Improvement Act had written a private corporation a charter of governmental authority, and the true measure of what Florida had surrendered lay not in the acreage or the boundary lines, but in the specific powers enumerated in the clauses of those 92 pages. They were powers no county in America held, and no ordinary government would have dared to request. What the state had actually inscribed into its statute books in the plain daylight of a Tallahassee legislative session was a catalogue of sovereignty whose full reach would not be understood until each of its provisions was read aloud, one authority at a time. Chapter 5. The Powers No County Held. Read one clause at a time, aloud in a quiet room with the printed statute open on the table, the 92 pages of the Reedy Creek Improvement Act stopped resembling the charter of a drainage district and began to read like the founding document of a small country. Each provision granted the company's district an authority that Florida ordinarily reserved to its elected county governments, and taken in sequence, the provisions assembled a catalogue of powers that no courthouse in Orange or Osceola County had ever been permitted to hold over its own ground. The first of them concerned the buildings themselves. The statute gave the district the authority to write its own building codes and to license its own inspectors, and it exempted the company's construction sites from much of the state building code that bound every other contractor, scaffold, and pouring of concrete in Central Florida. Where an ordinary developer submitted his blueprints to a county building department and waited on a county inspector's signature, the district could approve its own plans against standards it had written for itself and send its own men in hard hats to certify its own steel. The tallest structures rising over the drained swamp would answer to a code the landowner had authored. The second power was the badge. The act granted the district its own police power, the legal standing to organize and command a law enforcement force over the territory inside its boundaries, with much of the authority a county sheriff held over the roads and property under his jurisdiction. A private company had been handed the statutory right to police the ground it owned. Alongside it came the third power, written in the same plain administrative language. The district could raise and run its own fire department and its own emergency medical services, its own firehouses and ladder trucks and ambulances, answerable to the district's board rather than to any county fire chief. To this point, the powers, however unusual in one landowner's hands, still described the ordinary machinery of local government, the codes and cruisers and fire engines any county maintained. Then the 92 pages accelerated past anything a county did. Folded into the same statute, phrased with the same dry confidence as the clauses on drainage easements and plat boundaries, was the legal authority for the district to build and to operate its own nuclear power plant. A theme park charter, signed as economic development paperwork, carried on its printed face the right to raise a reactor and its cooling towers over the Florida interior and to generate its own electricity from the atom, a power the United States otherwise granted only to utilities and to governments. And the statute went further still. The act also gave the district the right to build and to run its own airport, to lay its own runways across the pasture, and to raise its own control tower over them, a working commercial field owned and governed by a single corporation. Set side by side, the clauses read like the inventory of a sovereign state rather than a resort. the right to write law over construction, the right to field police, the right to command fire and rescue, the right to split the atom, the right to open the sky. Each was a line in a Florida statute book, and each belonged to a company. What made the catalog stranger still was how little of it the company would ever use. The district exercised its ordinary powers constantly, and would go on doing so for decades, inspecting its own construction, laying its own utility lines, running one of the busiest firehouses in the region. The extraordinary powers it simply held in reserve. No reactor ever rose above the tree line, no cooling tower, no atomic plant, no glow of a private power station over the swamp. No airport was ever built, no runway paved, no control tower raised, no district-owned field open to the sky. The nuclear authority and the airport authority sat unused on the statute books. Latent options a private government had been granted and chose not to spend, remaining on the page, unexercised, for more than half a century. Their true value was never in the building. A company that could lawfully erect a nuclear reactor did not need to erect one. The point was that Florida had conceded the right, and a landowner armed with the legal standing to build an atomic plant and a commercial airport was a landowner no county commission would casually cross. The powers served as leverage far more than as any real blueprint, a demonstration on the printed page of exactly how far the state had stepped back from the drained interior. The reactor that was never built and the runway that was never paved showed the scale of that surrender more plainly than anything the district actually constructed. Yet, for all their spectacle, the nuclear plant and the airport were not, in the end, the most consequential thing the 92 pages contained. A reactor unbuilt threatened no one. A runway unpaved changed nothing on the ground. The powers that filled the statute's technical clauses, the codes and the police and the fire trucks and the atom and the airfield, described what the district was permitted to do with its land. They said nothing about who would decide it. The most extraordinary provision in the entire act lay not in any of the works the company could raise over the swamp, but in a quiet mechanism buried deeper in the pages, a rule governing the one thing every government finally rests upon, the ballot that chose who would run it. And that ballot had been drawn so that its outcome was settled before any vote inside the district was ever cast. Chapter 6. The election that could not be lost. The mechanism buried deeper in the 92 pages was not a work of engineering, but a ballot box. The strangest authority the statute conferred on the Reedy Creek Improvement District was the power to hold elections whose result was settled before a single vote was ever marked, and to hold them lawfully, in the open, under the ordinary forms of American local government. Everything the district did, its budgets, its municipal bonds, its building codes, its firehouses, flowed from a 5-member board of supervisors, and the whole of the design turned on the single question of who was permitted to choose those 5. In an ordinary Florida town, the answer would have been its residents, each dropping one ballot into a booth on Election Day. The Reedy Creek statute answered differently. Its supervisors were elected not by the people who lived inside the district, but by the people who owned the land beneath it, and the ballots were weighted by the acre. 1 vote per acre owned was the rule written into the charter, so that a citizen holding a single lot cast a single vote, while a landholder holding 10,000 acres cast 10,000. The election was settled by land deeds, rather than by the number of residents, counted off the surveyor's plat map instead of the census roll. Across the drained interior of the district, nearly every acre belonged to one owner. The Walt Disney Company and its subsidiaries held almost the entire surface of the land the charter enclosed, and under a rule that counted votes by the acre, That ownership was not merely a majority, but an avalanche. No coalition of small holders could ever be assembled against it, because there were almost no small holders and almost no land left over to hold. The arithmetic was fixed at the moment the deeds were recorded in the county courthouse. This was the ballot the company could never lose, a lawful election whose winner was determined not by persuasion or turnout, but by the register of who owned the ground. A government, though, is expected to have citizens, and a democracy is expected to have voters who breathe. To carry those forms convincingly, the district contained 2 incorporated municipalities of its own, 2 small cities drawn on the map inside the larger boundary, Bay Lake and Lake Buena Vista. They had names, limits, and the full machinery of towns, mayors, and councils, and scheduled municipal elections, and like any Florida city, they needed living residents to fill those offices and cast those local votes. So the company supplied them. Disney built company housing inside the 2 cities and settled within it a small population of hand-picked employees, a few dozen people living in mobile homes and dwellings the corporation owned, on land the corporation owned, holding the jobs the corporation assigned. These were the registered citizens of Bay Lake and Lake Buena Vista, chosen the way a stage set is dressed, present to make an empty government look inhabited. The numbers stayed almost impossibly small. At the 2000 census, the city of Bay Lake counted 23 residents, and the city of Lake Buena Vista counted 16, fewer than 40 people in total, between 2 chartered municipalities that sat at the center of one of the most visited places on Earth. Those residents could vote in their own city elections and choose the mayors and councils of Bay Lake and Lake Buena Vista. But they owned none of the land, and so under the 1 vote per acre rule, they held no vote whatever over the district that actually governed the ground, its codes, its police force, its debt. They could elect the officials of a nearly empty town and touch nothing that mattered. The design closed every exit that an ordinary democracy leaves open. In a conventional company town, the workers who filled the streets could in time register, organize, and outvote the corporation that built it, and more than one American company town had slipped from its founders' hands exactly that way. Reedy Creek had removed the danger at its root by tying the franchise to land instead of to people. Its residents could multiply, age, marry, and vote in their little municipal booths, and none of it could shift a single supervisor's seat because the seats answered to acreage and the acreage answered to Disney. The trappings of self-government were complete and genuine. A 5-member board, 2 chartered cities, sworn officials, printed ballots, and elections held on schedule. Underneath them, a single corporation elected itself to power in perpetuity by counting the acres it already owned. It was, by any measure, an elegant piece of machinery, a private state fitted with the full vocabulary of a public one, engineered so that whoever owned the land would own the government of the land for as long as he cared to keep the deeds in his name. But the man who had conceived it, who had sent his lawyers into the central Florida swamp to buy the ground in secret precisely so that he might one day govern it, would never see the first supervisor take a seat or the first small-town mayor sworn in. Walt Disney was already gone. He had died in the December before the statute was signed, and the kingdom whose ballot could never be lost would hold its first election without the only man who had ever fully known what he had meant it to become. Chapter 7. The Dream That Died with Its Maker. The district would hold its first election, raise its first firehouse, and drain its first canal without the man who had imagined every line of it. Walt Disney did not live to see the government he had spent his final years designing. He died in December of 1966. His passing carried in newspapers and on newsreels across the country, months before the Florida legislature would sign the statute that turned his central Florida swampland into a private state. What almost no one outside his closest circle yet understood was that the theme park rising in the plans was never the whole of the dream. The parks in California had already made Disney the most famous entertainer in the world, and a resort among the Florida lakes would have doubled that fortune on its own. But the drained interior he had bought in secret, tens of thousands of acres stitched together under invented company names, was meant to hold something no corporation in America had ever built. Behind the castle and the rides, on the empty plat maps of Orange and Osceola counties, Disney intended to raise a city. He called it the Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow. In the drawings and scale models he left behind, it was not a slogan, but a working town, a planned city of the future, sheltered from the weather and threaded with clean, modern transit. Its neighborhoods laid out for a real and permanent population. Its residents would wake each morning inside a place the company owned outright, walk streets the company had paved, and live under rules the company alone had written. The extraordinary charter powers that let the district govern itself as though it were a county had a purpose far stranger than any resort required. They were meant to govern people. Disney was not only building an attraction along the swamp roads of Central Florida, he was designing a place where families would spend their whole lives under the authority of a corporation. Then Walt Disney died, and the city he had imagined did not outlive him. The men who inherited the Walt Disney Company were showmen and financiers, not builders of cities. A functioning town with its schools, its sewers, its clinics, and its residents who could fall ill, organize, and one day demand a real vote, was a burden the surviving executives had no wish to carry. So the city of tomorrow was quietly folded away, its models crated, its blueprints shelved. What opened on the drained Florida ground in 1971 was not a community at all. It was a theme park, the Magic Kingdom, a grander cousin of the California original, ringed by hotels along the man-made lakes and inhabited by no permanent citizens whatever. And yet the company kept the government. The city was abandoned, but the sovereignty was not. The charter, the district, the county-level authority, and the acre-weighted ballot were all retained and turned to a new and smaller task, the running of a resort that had no need of them. Through the first years, cranes rose over the reclaimed swamp, and drainage canals were cut where the imagined avenues would have run, while the plans for the living city stayed in their crates. The instrument built to rule a population passed to a company that would use it to lay water lines, inspect its own buildings, and dispatch its own fire trucks. The handful of company residents who had been meant as the first citizens of a great city became instead the permanent stand-ins for a public that would never arrive, a few dozen employees keeping a government's forms alive at the center of a resort. There was something quietly mournful in what had been lost on that Florida ground. Whatever else it had been, the city of tomorrow was an attempt to build a place for ordinary people to live, a genuine community with a genuine future written into its plans. What survived the founder was the machinery of that ambition emptied of its purpose, a government with almost nothing to govern, the apparatus of a state inherited by a corporation that wanted only to run a park. The town that would have held real lives was never built, but the private state that would have ruled it stayed on, intact and unopposed, on the plat maps and in the statute books. So the government outlived the man who had built it. The authority Walt Disney had won but never lived to use passed whole to the company that survived him, And when the Magic Kingdom opened its gates among the central Florida pines in 1971, the private state around it was already in force, already drawing its boundaries and running its own affairs behind the ticket booths. It would go on governing the ground beneath one of the most visited places on Earth, quietly and almost invisibly, for the next half a century. Chapter 8. 50 Years as its own state. The private government now settled into the long, unglamorous work of ruling. Behind the turnstiles of the Magic Kingdom, the authority Walt Disney had won but never lived to use took up the ordinary business of a state. Season after season, the Reedy Creek Administration building along the resort roads issued permits, inspected its own construction, and sent its own crews across the reclaimed swamp of Orange and Osceola counties. The men who ran it answered to the company's board and to no county commission, and for the next 50 years, almost no one who visited would notice that the ground beneath the parking fields and the monorail track belonged, in law, to a corporation that governed itself. What that self-rule looked like, day to day, was infrastructure. The district laid and maintained its own water lines and treatment plants, carried its own electrical power across the resort, and kept clear the drainage canals that stopped the old cypress swamp from creeping back over the streets. It built and paved its own road network and the overpasses that fed the parking lots, enforced the building codes that governed every new hotel and ride, and licensed the inspectors who signed off on them. A private system of monorails and lake boats moved the crowds between the parks and the hotels, all of it built, powered, and kept running by the district itself. Where an ordinary developer waited on a county office to approve a plan or repair a culvert, the company approved and repaired its own, on its own schedule, inside its own boundary. Nowhere was the arrangement more striking than in the district's fire and emergency service. The Reedy Creek Fire Department grew into one of the most capable in the state of Florida, its firehouses staffed around the clock, its ladder trucks and ambulances scaled for a resort that drew larger crowds on an ordinary afternoon than most Florida towns held in total. Its paramedics answered heart attacks on the midway and accidents on the service roads, and its crews trained for fires in tall hotels and packed queues that a small county department could never have covered. A guest carried from a ride to a waiting ambulance never learned that the medics, the trucks, and the water in the hydrants all belonged to the same private government. The bargain worked, quietly, for both sides. Florida had handed a company the authority of a county, and in return the state received what it had wanted since the middle of the 1960s and never stopped wanting: tens of thousands of jobs, a steady flood of tourist money into Central Florida, and the prestige of the most famous resort on Earth rising on land once written off as worthless swamp. And because the company paid for all of it, the surrounding counties carried almost none of the cost. Orange and Osceola never had to run water mains out to the resort, never staffed a firehouse for it, and never widened a public highway to reach its gates. The most demanding development in the region supplied, policed, and protected itself, while the two counties collected the payrolls and the tax revenue and were handed no bill for the streets and the sewers behind the gates. It was an arrangement a public treasury could only welcome, and for decades no one in Tallahassee or the county seats had any appetite to end it. The account of how a corporate government this large was finally pulled apart is still ahead. If the slow rise and ruin of America's hidden empires is the kind of history you want more of, this channel is Empire of Acres, and subscribing is how you make sure the next one reaches you. For the arrangement did not stay small. What had opened in 1971 as a single theme park spread across the district's nearly 25,000 acres into a resort the size of a city. More parks and hotels rose along the man-made lakes, the road network lengthened year by year, and the workforce that ran it all swelled until Walt Disney World stood as the largest single-site employer in the state of Florida, a payroll the size of a small city's population gathered on one company's private land. On a crowded day, the resort held more people inside its boundary than lived in many of the surrounding towns of Orange and Osceola counties, every one of them walking roads, drinking water, and drawing power that a private government quietly supplied. A settlement large enough to be a city of its own had grown on the drained swamp, and it answered to no mayor and no council that a visitor could have named. For all that reach, the government stayed nearly invisible to the very people it served. The crowds who filed through the gates each year saw a resort and not a state, and never suspected that the smooth roads, the clean water, the quick ambulances, and the inspected rides were the work of an authority the company itself elected and controlled. There were no campaign signs along the resort roads, no public hearings a tourist might wander into, no town square where the government showed its face. Its only real residents were a few dozen company employees housed in its two small towns, and its board met not as public officials answerable to a citizenry, but as officers of the firm. It was, in the most literal sense, a private company wearing the working powers of a state, and it did so without fanfare for half a century, at the heart of one of the busiest resorts in the world. But a government, even a silent one, has to pay for what it builds. Every canal cut through the swamp, every firehouse raised, and every mile of resort road had been financed somehow across those 50 years, and the manner in which Reedy Creek paid for its long self-rule was the single power that would matter most when the end finally came. It ran on money the district could borrow in the public's name. Chapter 9. The Debt with a Crown on It. It ran on money the district could borrow in the public's name, and that single line held the whole strange arithmetic of the kingdom. A private corporation builds with its own cash, or with loans it repays at a bank's price. But the Reedy Creek Improvement District was not in law a private corporation. It was a government, and governments have a cheaper way to pay for canals and firehouses and paved resort roads. Because the state of Florida had chartered Reedy Creek as a governmental special district, it could do what no company on earth is permitted to do. It could issue tax-exempt municipal bonds, the same instrument a city uses to lay a sewer line or a county uses to raise a courthouse. Investors who bought Reedy Creek bonds collected interest the federal government did not tax, and so they accepted a lower rate in return. The district borrowed at the price a public government pays, well beneath any rate the Walt Disney Company itself could have gotten from a private lender. That was the quiet engine humming beneath the whole resort. The water lines and treatment plants, the overpasses feeding the parking fields, the drainage canals cut through the old cypress swamp, the firehouses raised across the nearly 25,000 acres. Much of it was built not with the company's cash, but with borrowed public money, financed through bond certificates sold in the district's name to buyers who trusted a government to pay them back. Therefore, the corporation that ran itself as a country also financed itself as one, reaching into a municipal bond market that ordinary businesses are locked out of entirely. The people who lent that money were not Disney executives or Florida officials. They were pension funds and bond investors scattered across the country, the same buyers who finance school districts and turnpikes, drawn to Reedy Creek because a government's debt is safe debt, secured by the power to tax. Each of them held a printed certificate promising that a public authority in Central Florida would repay them with interest, year upon year, out of taxes levied inside the district's boundary. Few of them likely understood that the public authority in question was, for every practical purpose, a single entertainment company wearing the robes of a state. and it borrowed on a scale to match the kingdom. By the early 2020s, the district carried close to $1 billion in outstanding bonds, a public debt larger than that of many a real American city. Yet the arrangement held a hidden symmetry that kept it from ever troubling an outside taxpayer. The bonds were backed by the district's own tax revenue, and nearly every taxable acre inside its boundary belonged to Disney. The company, in effect, taxed itself to repay the money its government had borrowed, and no homeowner in the surrounding towns paid a cent toward the resort's canals or its ambulances. For half a century that symmetry held, self-contained and unremarked. But a debt does not care who intended to pay it. A bond is a promise the district made, and a special district is a creature of the state that made it, its obligations able to pass to whatever government inherits its ground once it is gone. So long as Reedy Creek existed to tax Disney's land, Disney's taxes served the debt and the ledger balanced. The whole arrangement held only for as long as the district itself survived. If the district ever vanished, the crown of debt resting upon it would have to come down onto some other head. And the only heads waiting beneath it were Orange and Osceola counties, the two ordinary Florida governments whose jurisdiction had receded to the district's edge back in 1967. Their taxpayers were schoolteachers and grove workers and retirees in the towns ringing the parks, people who had never owned a foot of the Magic Kingdom and had never cast a ballot in its landowner election. Should the state ever dissolve the district and fold its territory back into the counties, close to $1 billion in bonds could settle onto them, along with the fire trucks and the water plants the company had always paid for itself. For 50 years, no one in the Florida capital had any reason to reach for that lever. The bargain worked, the bonds were serviced, and the counties were spared the bill. Therefore, the danger stayed theoretical. A line in the fine print of a government almost no one remembered was a government at all. But an arrangement that survives only as long as no one grows angry enough to break it does not survive forever. In 2022, in the marble corridors of Tallahassee, someone finally decided to make the district vanish. Chapter 10. The Kingdom is Condemned. Someone in the marble corridors of Tallahassee had finally decided to make the district vanish, and in the spring of 2022, the machinery of the Florida legislature turned against the very government it had built 55 years before. For half a century, the Reedy Creek Improvement District had been left untouched because no one in the state capital had a reason to reach for it. But a quarrel had opened between the Walt Disney Company and the political leadership of the state of Florida, a public falling out that spilled from the boardroom into the legislative chamber. The substance of that dispute mattered less, in the end, than its consequence inside the Florida capital. What had begun as a clash of words became within days a formal move to abolish a government. The instrument was a special legislative session convened in Tallahassee in April of 2022. Into it, the legislature carried Senate Bill 4-C, a short measure with a very long reach. Where the 92-page Act of 1967 had conjured the district into being, this new bill did the opposite in a few plain paragraphs of statute. It repealed the Reedy Creek Improvement Act outright, and with it, the charter of the strangest local government in the state. The speed was its most striking feature. A government that had taken years of secret land buying and a full session of the legislature to assemble was condemned in the span of a few days on the chamber floor. On the 22nd of April, 2022, the governor of Florida signed the repeal into law. The special district that had governed the ground beneath the most visited resort in the state was set to cease to exist on the 1st of June, 2023. The statute fixed a date, and a clock began to run against the kingdom. But a government is not a light switch, and abolishing one is not the same as dissolving the obligations it carries. Almost at once, as analysts read the single repealing page against the thousands of pages of district it erased, an alarming problem surfaced in the corridors of the Florida Capitol. The bill said clearly what would end. It said almost nothing about what would become of everything the ending left behind. Chief among those things was the debt. The district carried close to $1 billion in outstanding bonds, and by the same settled rule that had shadowed the arrangement from the start, those obligations would fall to whatever government absorbed the land. The governments waiting to absorb Reedy Creek's ground were Orange County and Osceola County. The arithmetic that had balanced so quietly for 50 years now threatened to tip the wrong way. So long as the district survived, the company's own land taxes had serviced the bonds and paid for the fire trucks and the water treatment plants. Dissolve the district, and that self-contained bargain broke open across the county line. Close to $1 billion in bonds, together with the duty to run the fire departments and the utilities that served the resort, could settle onto the ledgers of Orange and Osceola counties. Local officials in the two county courthouses did the sums and did not like the answer. Commissioners in Orange and Osceola warned that the sudden inheritance could force a property tax increase on residents who had played no part in the fight inside the Capitol. What had been advanced as a penalty aimed at a single corporation began to look, in the county buildings, like a bill about to be handed to the public. The repeal, meant to strip a company of its privileges, risked instead transferring the company's costs onto the very taxpayers the district had always spared. Therefore, the swift stroke in Tallahassee cooled into a slow problem of practical government. The state had voted to abolish the district, but it had not answered the plain question of who would carry what the district left behind. Between the signing in April of 2022 and the dissolution set for June of 2023 lay 13 long months, and through them the fate of the bonds, the fire trucks, and the water plants hung unresolved over the Florida Capitol. The kingdom stood condemned and would go on standing for 13 more months while the state worked out what its fall would cost. And in that gap of 13 months, the people who had governed Reedy Creek for half a century were far from idle. The company still held its board of supervisors, still commanded the machinery of the district it was about to lose, and it read the legislative calendar as plainly as anyone in Tallahassee. The state had announced exactly when it would seize the government. It had told the sitting rulers, in writing and in advance, the very day their kingdom would fall. But before the state could take the kingdom, its old rulers set a trap. In the final weeks before control changed hands, the outgoing board reached for an instrument centuries old and wrote into a quiet contract a clause built to bind their successors long after every person in the room was gone. Chapter 11. The Clause of the Dying King. The trap was not sprung with a raid or a lawsuit. It was sprung with paper. In the final weeks before control of the district changed hands, the outgoing Board of Supervisors gathered in a Reedy Creek meeting room, laid a thick sheaf of contracts on the table, and voted to bind their own successors for a span of time no ordinary agreement had ever tried to reach. The date was the 8th of February, 2023, and it was chosen with care. On the following morning, the 9th of February, the Florida House of Representatives was scheduled to vote on the measure that would hand the governor control of the district and seat appointees of his own in place of the sitting board. The old rulers held one clear day of authority in their hands, and they spent every hour of it. Around the table sat the same Disney-aligned supervisors who had governed the ground beneath the resort for years, and on the agenda before them lay a development agreement and a set of restrictive covenants drafted for exactly this moment. The documents looked like nothing at all. On their face, they were the routine instruments of land planning, the sort of contract a district signs with a landholder to govern what may be built and where. In substance, they handed sweeping authority over the district's land and design back to the Walt Disney Company and stripped the incoming board of much of the power the legislature was about to grant it. Building rights, design approvals, even the use of the district's own name and likeness, provision by provision, the outgoing board signed the levers of the office away before the new officers could reach their chairs. The true astonishment lay buried in the fine print of the term. Every contract must state how long it lasts, and nearly all of them counted in years or in decades. This one, in the paragraph numbered Section 7.1, fixed its expiration by a stranger measure. The agreement would remain in force, it read, until 21 years after the death of the last survivor of the descendants of King Charles III, King of England, living on the date the declaration was signed. The sentence has the ring of an antiquarian joke. It is instead one of the oldest and most durable devices in Anglo-American law, and the reason a central Florida land contract reached across an ocean to a British monarch runs centuries deep. The law has always distrusted the dead hand, the owner who tries to command his property forever and bind generations not yet born to terms they never accepted. To curb that reach, the common law courts built the rule against perpetuities, a principle that voids any future claim on property that might take effect too far off in time. The permitted horizon has a peculiar shape. An interest survives only if it is certain to settle within 21 years after the death of some person already alive when the document takes force. That chosen person is called a measuring life. Draftsmen learned long ago that the measuring life need not be anyone tied to the bargain. It can be a total stranger, selected for one quality alone, that the date of their death will be recorded beyond dispute. And no deaths are registered more faithfully than those of a royal family, whose births and funerals are published for the world. So the Royal Lives Clause entered the lawyer's toolbox. Instead of a single frail life, the drafter names the living descendants of a reigning monarch, a large and well-tended group whose last survivor will not die for generations. By tying its clock to the descendants of King Charles III, the Reedy Creek Agreement gathered dozens of measuring lives, many of them young children in the palaces and nurseries of Britain, and pushed the far edge of the contract toward the closing years of the 21st century. It was a device far more at home in Old English wills and family trusts than in the government of a Florida tourist district. There, a landed family might keep an estate whole across the generations by hanging its terms on the life of a distant prince, so that no heir could break the arrangement before the appointed lives had run out. The Reedy Creek lawyers borrowed the same mechanism and turned it to the defense of a resort. On paper, the drafting was elegant. In effect, it meant that the deal signed in that meeting room could bind the district's government well past the year 2100, long after every hand that drafted it, every vote that passed it, and every voice that opposed it had fallen silent. The effect on the incoming board was close to total. When the governor's appointees arrived to take up the government they had been promised, they found a working district whose most valuable powers had been contracted away the day before they walked in, locked in place by a term set to outlast every official in the room, and very likely every citizen then alive in the state. The new board declared itself, in plain words, left powerless over the very land it had been created to govern. Here the story divides, and reasonable people have landed on opposite sides of it. On one account, a company reached for every lawful tool a landowner possesses to defend a grant the state had freely made half a century earlier and now moved to strip away. On another, The same signed pages show a corporation quietly writing itself a contract built to outlast the very government elected to check it. Which one do you see? The same pages carry the date of the 8th of February and the name of the same living king, whichever way a reader turns them. What is not in dispute is that the maneuver did not go unanswered. The governor's board refused to accept the papers left waiting on its table and carried the fight out of the district meeting room and back into the marble corridors of the Florida Capitol. There, the state that had already condemned the kingdom now set out to condemn its parting contract as well. The trap had been laid with great cleverness. The answer, when it came, would be written not in covenants, but in statute, and it would test whether a legislature could unmake with one law what a boardroom had built with another. Chapter 12. The Governor's Board. The answer came, as it had been promised, not in covenants, but in statute. While the outgoing board's contracts still sat on the table in the Reedy Creek meeting room, the Florida legislature was already moving inside the marble chambers of the Capitol in Tallahassee to take the district back by law. On the 9th of February, 2023, the Florida House of Representatives voted to strip the old board of its authority and place the district under the control of the state. A companion measure, signed into law later that same month, rewrote the district's charter outright. The special district that had carried the name Reedy Creek Improvement District for more than half a century was dissolved under that name and reconstituted under another. It became the Central Florida Tourism Oversight District, a government of the same drained swampland and the same theme parks, wearing a plainer and more public title. The new name was the smallest part of the change. What mattered was that the district had passed into different hands. Under the old charter, the supervisors who governed the ground beneath the resort had been chosen in an election weighted by the acre inside a district the company owned almost in its entirety. It was the ballot the company could never lose. The state did not defeat that ballot at the polls because no outside vote had ever been able to reach it. Instead, the new statute abolished the ballot itself. In its place, it seated a 5-member board appointed by the governor of Florida and confirmed by the state Senate, officers who owed their chairs not to any landholder's acreage, but to the elected government in Tallahassee. The company had never lost the election at the ballot box. The legislature had simply abolished the election altogether, and with it went the last private lever the company had held over its own government. The appointees who filled those chairs took up an office that had been hollowed out beneath them. In its final hours of authority, the departing board had signed away much of the district's power in a development agreement written to endure for generations, and the new members soon declared themselves the rulers of a government whose most valuable authority had been contracted out the night before they walked in. So the legislature that had rewritten the charter was called back to finish the work. In the months that followed, the state passed a further measure, Senate Bill 1604, drafted for a single purpose, to declare the outgoing board's development agreement and its restrictive covenants void and without legal force. A boardroom had tried to bind the district with a contract meant to outlast the century. A legislature now answered with a law that swept the contract away. The reaching hand the old rulers had extended from their last meeting was met by the plain power of the state to legislate. The company did not accept the reversal in silence. The dispute left the legislative chamber and moved into the courtrooms in both state and federal forums, where attorneys for the corporation and attorneys for the state took up the questions the new statutes had raised. Whether the takeover of the district had been lawful and whether a single act of the legislature could truly unmake the covenants a departing board had signed became matters for judges to weigh rather than lawmakers to declare, and they did not resolve in a season. What the whole sequence accomplished, beneath the litigation, was a conversion of kind. For more than 50 years, the district had been, in its outward form, a public government, and in its working reality, an instrument of one company, its board seated by the company's own votes, and its business conducted in near total quiet. Now the same offices passed into public hands. The board answered to the state, its members named by the governor, its meetings attended by reporters and residents who had never before had reason to sit in the room. The government the company had operated so quietly for half a century had been made a government of the state, conducted in the open. And yet, for all the weight of the statutes and all the noise of the courtrooms, the ground itself looked very much as it always had. The lettering on the administration building had changed, and the faces at the board table had changed, but the land lay exactly where it had lain. The resort still drew its millions through the gates. The district's fire engines still rolled from the same stations, and the debt the district had borrowed still stood on the same public books, owed and unretired. The kingdom had a new sovereign and the identical borders. The authority had passed into new hands, but almost nothing that authority actually governed had moved at all. Whether that made the long story a genuine ending or only a change of management was a question the record left open, waiting on the land itself to answer. Chapter 13. The land remembers the company. The land answered the way land always does, which is to say it did not answer at all. The drained swampland that a lawyer had once bought under a borrowed name still lay beneath the resort, crossed by the same service roads and the same drainage canals, and the question the record had left open sank into it like rainwater into low ground. A new board now met inside the administration building, its meetings open to reporters and residents who had never before had reason to sit in the room, its nameplate reading Central Florida Tourism Oversight District, where a different name had hung for 55 years. The lettering on the wall had changed, though the ground beneath it lay exactly as before. What the dissolution had promised to sweep away proved far harder to move than a name. The district's fire engines still rolled from the same stations toward the same theme park crowds. The water still ran through pipes the district itself had laid, and close to $1 billion in bonds still stood on the public books, owed and unretired, secured against the very acres the fight had been about. In the state and federal courtrooms, attorneys for the company and attorneys for the state went on weighing whether a single legislature could truly unmake what an earlier boardroom had signed, and the dockets did not close in a season. The kingdom had a new sovereign and its old borders, a public board above it, and its private debt beneath it, and the daily machinery of a self-governing resort grinding on between the two, indifferent to which hand now held the papers. Beneath the legal argument sat a plainer worry the courtrooms could not quickly settle. If the district were ever truly unwound, the same settled rule that had shadowed it from the start would hand its obligations to whatever authority absorbed the land, and the better part of $1 billion in bonds could come to rest on Orange and Osceola counties and the ordinary households inside them, who now watched from the far side of the fight to learn whose debt the resort's half-century of self-rule would in the end become. That question, too, lay on the land unanswered, and the record set it down beside the rest. Set against the length of the story, the change of name looked very small. For 55 years, a single entertainment company had held, in plain law, the working powers of a government over its own stretch of the United States, and it had held them not in some remote and empty territory, but beneath the most visited resort in the state, in open view of the millions who passed through the turnstiles each year and saw only a theme park. The deeds recorded it. The 92-page statute recorded it. The weighted ballots and the tax-exempt bonds recorded it. A company had become a government, in full daylight, on land that families toured in shorts and sun hats, and for half a century almost no one who walked its clean sidewalks had any reason to notice the small private country they were standing inside. There are still people who remember the ground before the company held it. If you worked inside the district, or grew up in Orange or Osceola County, or knew that stretch of central Florida when it was cattle pasture and cypress stand and two-lane road, set down what stood on the land before the parks rose over it. Name the vanished town, the citrus grove, the family that signed the deed without knowing the buyer, the swamp that had no gates. The record has kept the company's invented names with great care. It is worth keeping the older ones beside them. And the company's own names it did keep, in the one place it chose to keep them. Above the shop fronts of Main Street, painted across the upper-story windows in the gold lettering of a street that did not exist until the company built it, the phantom buyers still hang. I-4 Corporation, Compass East, the Latin American Development and Management Corporation, and the others that had fanned out across the central Florida swampland 6 decades before, so that no seller would ever learn whose land he was standing on. They were shell companies dissolved long before the district itself was dissolved, names that never traded and never built a single thing. They remain the only monument the secret ever received, gold letters on the upper windows of a main street laid across a drained swamp, looking down each day on a crowd that does not read them, above a kingdom that outlasted the men who assembled it and the government it had quietly become.